This is how much I made last year. This is how much I make now. In this video, I'm going to share my story of how I did this. Throughout this video, I'm going to share 3 key lessons to help you do exactly the same. So, believe it or not, it all started right here, with my hands squishing an expired chocolate cake, making $10 an hour in a grocery store bakery. I hated my job, and I wanted to quit more than anything, but I was 20, broke, and I did not want to go back to school. Now, to most, this would seem like a disadvantage, but for me, these were the reasons I succeeded. Now, this brings me to the first lesson. Don't let where you've been dictate where you're going. Oftentimes as humans, we find ourselves living a certain way, not because we want to, but because it's the way things have been as long as we remember. Whether it's being addicted to drugs, being in a toxic relationship, or working a dead-end job. These are all things that we can change if we don't settle for the way things are. Alright, Gabriel. That was a very good lesson, but now, back to the story. It took me about a year of hating my life every day to learn this at that bakery. But eventually, once I had a small safety net, I handed in my notice and started planning my next move. I've had a passion for tech ever since I was a kid, so I started looking for a way to break in. So I put out thousands of applications to any job that would let me work with computers. In a few weeks' time, I got an interview for a help desk position where I got to help people with computers and work from home. So I spent every single day before this interview prepping, and it paid off. I landed it. And that brings us to lesson 2. Oh, there we go. Take calculated risks. Take something that you've wanted to do for a while, but you've been too scared to. Maybe it's asking out that girl. Maybe it's pursuing your dream job. Maybe it's trying a new condiment. Whatever it is, make a list of all the bad things that could go horribly wrong, and a list of the great things that could happen if it goes right. Often, you'll find the worst case isn't really that bad. Like, for me, the absolute worst case scenario was I continue to live with my parents and I would have a little bit less McDonald's money. And the upside was potentially not hating my job and significantly increasing my income and future job prospects. That was a no-brainer for me. Okay, so anyway, back to the story. This is me. And this is the corporate totem pole. So it turns out there are a couple of ways of climbing up this bad boy. The first is to go from L1 to L2 to L3 to L4, and you get the idea. Or there's another way. You can just get really, really good at whatever particular level you want to go to, and then do an internal interview and start there. So that was my goal. I just get really good at coding, and I just jumped straight there. Okay, so now I had a pretty good idea of where I wanted to go and the general direction of how to get there, but it's still hugely important to map out your exact path. For me, my map to get there was a calendar. It was a little more detailed than the one you're seeing now, but ultimately, the idea is to plan out what you have to do every single day in advance. Take some time to figure out what exactly you need to know and break it up into days. For me, it was 2 to 4 hours of work every single day. This made it so easy for me to sit down and knock out the project or concept I had to learn, and I wouldn't get up until I felt really solid on the concept or the project was done. You'll also find once you start crossing off more and more consecutive days, it'll get easier and easier to continue until it's not even work anymore, and it's just something you want to do. So, I put my 4-month plan into action. I followed this plan perfectly and didn't miss a single day. At this point, I definitely wasn't ready for top-tier companies, but I started putting applications out anyway. A few weeks later, I had 7 interviews, and once I did those, 3 of them turned into offers. I ended up accepting my favorite out of those previous offers, which was for $60K, which again doubled my previous income. However, this company was a startup, which, relatively speaking, are easier to get into. My end goal was to get into one of the big tech companies, which are infamous for their ridiculously high pay. The problem is, they're also well known for their ridiculously difficult interview process. For reference, over 3 million people apply to Google every year, but only 20,000 are hired. That gives the company a 0.67% acceptance rate. Ultimately, after a few months of studying and around a dozen interviews, this culminated in a couple of offers. Out of these, Amazon was the most competitive, so I decided to take it. And that brings us to the third lesson. Pick a direction and stay in it. Sometimes life is like a bunch of big ol' windy roads. If you're in Texas and you decide you want to take a road trip to Arizona, but then on a whim you decide you want to go to Alabama instead, or maybe actually you'll just go to Ohio, you won't ever end up going anywhere. You'll probably never even leave Texas because it's so gosh darn big. But in all that time, if you just said, I'm going to the Grand Canyon because I don't like potatoes or my sister, then you could have probably already been there. Life is pretty similar. If we constantly change our path, we can end up going nowhere. For me, coding was the first thing that I really dedicated myself to. It may not be coding for you, or maybe it is, but whatever it is, I just recommend you don't spend your whole life wandering around Texas.